Evelyn Harper had 1 second to decide, and she spent it grabbing the rifle barrel with both bare hands and pointing it straight up at the sky. The man on the other end of it went absolutely still. So did she. Neither of them breathed. Then she said, low and shaking and completely certain, "I am not what they told you I am. And I am not leaving until you know the difference." He didn't lower the gun, but he didn't pull the trigger either. And in the space between those two things, in that one suspended, dangerous, irreversible moment, everything between them began. If this story already has its hand around your heart, subscribe to this channel, stay with me until the very last word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1882 came to the Montana Territory, like a furnace door swinging open. The grass along the mountain trails burned gold and brittle by mid-morning. The creeks that used to run strong through June had already thinned to a whisper by the time July arrived. Every rancher, from Billings to the northern ridge, knew what a summer like this meant: short tempers, short water, and trouble moving faster than any man could outrun it. Caleb Thornton knew all of it. He'd lived alone on his mountain ranch for going on 6 years, and in that time he'd learned to read the land the way other men read newspapers. He knew when a storm was coming, 3 days before the clouds showed. He knew which section of his fence would buckle first under a hard wind. He knew exactly how many head of cattle he could run through a dry summer without losing a single one. What he did not know, what no amount of mountain living had prepared him for, was the sound of a woman's boot scraping against the iron gate of his property at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in the worst heat of the year. He heard it from the barn. He set down the bridle he'd been mending, picked up the Winchester that leaned against the stall post, and walked out without hurrying. Men who hurried in this country made mistakes. Caleb Thornton did not make mistakes. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped. There was a woman at his gate. She was standing barely. Both hands wrapped around two of the iron bars like the gate was the only thing keeping her upright. Her head was bowed. Her dress, blue prairie cotton, was dark with sweat at the collar and torn at the hem where something brush wire or hard miles had gotten hold of it. A canvas bag hung from one shoulder, small enough that it couldn't have held more than a few personal items. Her hair had come half loose from its pins and stuck to the back of her neck. She hadn't seen him yet. Caleb raised the rifle, not to fire. But because a man living alone this far from town didn't meet strangers without it. "Gates latched for a reason," he said. She lifted her head. Her eyes found him immediately, dark eyes, sharp even through the exhaustion sitting heavy in every line of her face. She didn't flinch at the rifle. That surprised him. Most men flinched at a rifle. This woman looked at it the way someone looks at weather. Like it was a fact she'd already accounted for. "I know," she said. Her voice came out rough, like she hadn't used it in some time. "I wasn't trying to open it. I was just..." She stopped. Took one breath. "I needed a moment. This ain't a rest stop, ma'am." "I can see that." He studied her. No horse, no companion. Nothing but that small bag and whatever was left in her legs, which didn't look like much. Behind her, the main trail stretched south, disappearing into the shimmer of afternoon heat. Nobody came up this trail by accident. It was a hard road even on horseback. On foot, in this heat, it was something close to punishment. "You walk up from the valley?" he asked. "I walked up from Harlan Creek." He stared at her. Harlan Creek was the closest thing this stretch of Montana had to a proper town, a main street, a sheriff's office, a general store, a church, and enough people to fill the church on Sundays and empty the saloon on Saturdays. It sat at the base of the mountain trail, south and east. By road, it was 31 miles. "That's 31 miles, he said. "I know how far it is, on foot. I'm aware." He lowered the rifle by about 2 inches. Not all the way, but 2 inches. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that was deciding something. "Because nobody in Harlan Creek would give me a horse," she said. and I needed to get away from Harlan Creek. He didn't open the gate right away. He stood there in the full weight of that July sun, and he looked at her, really looked the way a man looks at something that doesn't quite make sense yet, and he's waiting for it to resolve itself into something familiar. It didn't resolve. She just stood there, holding onto his gate, not asking for anything, which was the strangest part of all of it. Most people who showed up at a person's property wanting something came with a story already assembled, a reason, a justification, a pitch. This woman hadn't offered a single one. "What's your name?" he asked. Evelyn Harper. The name landed somewhere in the back of his memory and stirred something. He couldn't place it right away. Just a feeling, the way you recognize a face, before you can remember where you've seen it. "You got family up here?" "No." "You got business up here?" "Not yet." He almost said then, "You've got no reason to be here," and sent her back down the trail. He almost did that. The words were right there. Instead he said, "How long since you had water?" She blinked, like the question surprised her. "This morning." "Early." He muttered something under his breath, unlocked the gate, and swung it open. "Come inside. You can sit in the shade and drink something before you head back down." She stepped through the gate and stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the sunburn starting on her nose and forehead, the dried dust on her boots that went all the way up past her ankles. "I'm not going back down," she said. "Not tonight. Not until I've had a chance to explain something to you." He looked down at her. He was a full head taller, and built the way mountain work built a man, wide through the shoulders, thick through the forearms. Nothing soft about any of it. She was looking up at him without any sign of being afraid. "Explain what?" he said. "Why I'm here," she said. "And why you might want to listen." He gave her water first. He was not a man who rewarded presumption, and showing up at his gate with a demand wrapped up in a request was absolutely presumption. He knew that. He also knew that a woman who had walked 31 miles in July heat and was still standing upright and still forming full sentences had earned at least a cup of water before he sent her on her way. He brought her to the porch and set a tin cup and a pitcher on the rail. She drank 2 full cups without pausing, poured a third, and then sat down on the porch step like she'd been given permission, which she had not been. He pulled the other chair around and sat across from her, forearms on his knees, and waited. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she started again. "I lived in Harlan Creek for 2 years. I worked for Gerald Morrow. He owns the dry goods store on Main Street. I did his accounts, kept his ledgers. I was good at it. All right. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Morrow reported to Sheriff Dade that $40 had gone missing from the store's cash box. She sets it straight, no drama in it, like she'd practiced getting through it without her voice going sideways. He told the sheriff I took it. Caleb said nothing. "I did not take it," she said. "I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. I did not take Gerald Morrow's $40. You're saying he lied." "I'm saying $40 went missing, and I was the convenient explanation." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. "I had no family in town, nobody to speak for me. The sheriff asked me a few questions, decided Morrow's word outweighed mine, and told me to stay in town while he investigated. Which I did. For 2 weeks I stayed and I waited, and the investigation went nowhere because there was nothing to investigate. I hadn't done anything." She paused, took a breath. "Then last week Morrow told me he'd decided not to press charges, that he was generous if I signed a paper admitting I'd taken the money, and agreeing to work the debt off over 2 years without wages." Something shifted in Caleb's jaw. "I said no," Evelyn continued. "I told him I would not sign a lie. He told me that if I didn't sign, he'd see to it that every business in Harlan Creek knew what I'd done and I'd never work in the territory again." She looked up at him. He wasn't bluffing. By the next morning, every door on Main Street was closed to me. The boarding house asked me to leave. The church whose women stopped speaking to me. And the sheriff? The sheriff told me there wasn't much he could do about a man's opinion of a person. Silence stretched between them, long and hot. Caleb looked out at the trail she'd come up. He looked at the dust on her boots. He looked at the bag on the porch beside her, which held he could see the shape of it almost nothing. "So you walked up here," he said. I asked around. People said there was a rancher up on the North Ridge who kept to himself, who didn't care much about town business. She met his eyes. I figured a man who didn't care about town business might not care about town gossip either. "And what is it you're asking for, Miss Harper?" She didn't look away. "Work," she said. "Whatever you need done on this ranch. I can cook, sew, keep accounts, tend a garden, learn whatever you're willing to teach. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to earn enough to get myself to the next territory and start over somewhere. Nobody knows Gerald Morrow's version of my name." Caleb sat back. He looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the porch rail, and looked out at the mountain. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight," he said. "Tomorrow morning, we talk about whether there's work here for you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I ain't decided anything." He had decided something. He wouldn't have admitted that to himself at the time, but looking back later, much later, he would recognize the moment he made the decision. It wasn't when she told him her story. It wasn't even when she said the word work with that particular kind of dignity that only comes from someone who has never expected anything to be handed to them. It was when she finished her third cup of water and set the cup back on the porch rail very carefully, with both hands, like it was the finest china she'd ever touched. That was the moment. He'd been around people long enough, even living alone, to know the difference between some performing gratitude and someone actually feeling it. The way she set that tin cup down was real. Everything about it was real. He showed her the spare room. It was small, a single cot, a washstand, a window that faced east and got the morning light. He hadn't used it in years. It smelled like dust and cedar. "There's a wash basin in the hall," he said from the doorway. "Supper's at 6. I don't wait. I'll be there." He started to turn. "Mr. Thornton," he looked back. She was standing in the middle of the small room with her canvas bag in one hand, and her hair still half down and that sunburn rising on her face. And she looked for just a moment like someone who was trying very hard not to let relief break her open entirely. "I know this isn't a small thing," she said. "What you're doing. I know what people in town will say if they find out you've taken me in." "Miss Harper," he said, "I gave up caring what people in town say about me a long time ago." He went back to the barn and finished mending the bridle. He made supper that night the same way he always did, straightforward. No fuss. Beans, cornbread, a piece of cured ham from the cellar. He wasn't a man who cooked for pleasure. He cooked because a body needed fuel and because he'd learned, early in his solitary years, that a man who stopped taking care of himself stopped being good for anything at all. She came to the table exactly at 6. She'd washed her face and repinned her hair and changed into a different dress from her bag, a darker one, well-worn but clean. She sat down without being directed to a particular seat, chose the one across from him rather than beside him, which he noted, and folded her hands on the table and looked at the food. "This looks very good," she said. "It's beans. It's hot beans," she said. "That's more than I've had in 2 days." He served the food without comment. They ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people, each deciding how much of themselves they were willing to offer across a table to a stranger. "Halfway through supper," she said. "How long have you been up here alone?" 6 years. That's a long time. It suits me." She looked at him. "Does it?" Something in the question caught him wrong, not the words themselves, but the way she asked them. Not challenging, just genuinely curious. Like she actually wanted to know the answer. "Yes," he said. "And then, because it seemed required, I've got the cattle. The land. It's enough." She looked back at her plate. "I didn't mean any offense." None. A pause. "I used to think I preferred being alone too," she said. After my parents passed, I moved to 3 different towns trying to find a place where I fit. Harlan Creek was the first place I'd started to feel like maybe I could put down some roots. She turned her fork over in her hand. And then this happened. Caleb looked at her across the table. He could have said something empty that's hard, or things have a way of working out. He'd heard both those things said to him at the worst moment of his life, and he'd known immediately that they were nothing. Sound filling space. He said, "The world isn't fair to people who don't have someone standing beside them." She went still for a second. Then she nodded, slowly, like he'd said something that matched what she already knew to be true. They finished supper. She cleared the table without being asked. He didn't stop her. That night, lying on his cot in the dark, with the summer heat pressing down and the sound of the mountain moving through the pines outside, Caleb Thornton stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what exactly he'd done. He'd let a stranger into his house, a woman the nearest town had decided was a thief. A woman with no money, no horse, no family, and no plan beyond getting to the next territory and starting over with nothing. He'd given her the spare room and a hot meal and told her they'd talk tomorrow about whether there was work for her. There was work for her. He'd known that the moment she asked. A ranch this size, run by one man, always had more work than one man could properly do. He'd been managing, but managing and thriving were 2 different things. And the kitchen garden he kept meaning to expand, and the mending that piled up, and the bookkeeping he did badly, and the 100 small tasks that fell through the cracks of a solitary life, all of it would be better with another set of hands. That was the practical truth. The other truth, the one he prodded at carefully, the way you probe a sore spot to understand how bad it is, was the thing she'd said at the gate. "I'm not a thief." He believed her. He'd believed her within the first 2 minutes of looking at her. And he was not a man who believed things quickly or easily. 6 years of mountain living had cured him of that particular naivete. But there was something about the way she'd said it. No pleading in it. No performance. Just a statement of fact from someone who'd grown exhausted from having to say it and had stripped every unnecessary word away. He thought about Gerald Morrow. He didn't know Morrow well. He didn't know anyone in Harlan Creek well, but he knew the type. A man who held accounts over people's heads, who understood that a woman alone was a woman without witnesses, who knew that $40 in a story was enough to ruin a person if that person had nobody to stand up and say, "Wait now, let's hear all of it." He thought about what she'd said at supper. The world isn't fair to people who don't have someone standing beside them. He'd said it to her, but he knew it from his own life. He knew exactly what it meant to be someone the world had decided wasn't worth standing beside. He closed his eyes. He'd talk to her tomorrow, see what she could do. Make a decision based on practical considerations like a sensible man. He went to sleep telling himself that. Morning came, and with it, the sound of something happening in his kitchen. Caleb was up before dawn the way he always was. He dressed in the dark, pulled on his boots, and came down the hall to find the kitchen already somehow alive. The stove was going. Coffee was in the pot. The smell of it cut through the morning air like something sharp and welcome. Evelyn Harper was standing at the counter with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, cutting something. She looked up when he came in. "I found the flour and the salt pork," she said. "I hope that's all right. I didn't touch anything I wasn't sure about." He looked at the counter. She'd made biscuits. They were already in the pan, ready to go in the oven. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "You were up early," he said. "I'm always up early." She turned back to the counter. "I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up and expecting she stopped. I kept forgetting where I was." He understood that. He didn't say so, but he understood it. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and said, "Here's what I've got." She turned to face him, wiping her hands on a cloth. "The kitchen garden needs expanding and regular tending. It's been running small because I don't have time to give it proper attention." The mending on the ranch hands equipment I've got. 2 men who come through seasonally, and they're hard on their gear. The bookkeeping needs doing. I manage it, but I'm not good at it. And the house itself needs. He looked around. Things I haven't gotten to. I can do all of that, she said. The pay won't be much. Room and board and a modest wage. That's more than generous. It's fair, he corrected. Not generous. Fair. She looked at him for a moment. Something almost like a smile crossed her face, not a full smile, more like the idea of one. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then it settled. He drank his coffee. The biscuits went in the oven. Outside, the summer sun was already pulling itself up over the eastern ridge, turning the whole world gold and burning. Neither of them said anything else, but something had shifted quietly, like a latch lifting somewhere in the house, and both of them felt it without naming it. The particular weight of 2 solitary people sitting in the same kitchen with coffee between them, and the morning still new enough to be something other than ordinary. Caleb Thornton set down his cup and stood up. There's fence on the north pasture that needs looking at after breakfast, he said. You ride? Not well, she admitted. But I can learn. He reached for his hat from the hook beside the door. Then today, he said, we start there. The first morning they worked the fence line together, Caleb didn't say 10 words. That was fine with Evelyn. She hadn't come up the mountain for conversation. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference between choosing something and being pushed into it by every door in the valley swinging shut at once. But she was here now, and the work was real, and real work had always been the thing that kept her from falling apart when everything else was trying to make her do exactly that. She watched him work the fence the way he moved along the line, checking each post with both hands, testing the tension of the wire, noting which sections needed replacing without writing any of it down. All of it going into some internal ledger she didn't have access to. He worked fast and quiet and completely, the way people work when they've done a thing so many times it's become something closer to instinct than thought. She followed behind him and did what he showed her. He didn't explain more than once. She noticed that about him early. He'd demonstrate something, how to check a post for rot, how to splice a broken wire without cutting your hands open, and then he'd step back and watch her do it. If she got it right, he moved on. If she got it wrong, he'd say 2 or 3 words, adjust her grip or her angle, and then step back again. There was something almost respectful about it. Most men she'd known defaulted to explaining things as if the act of explaining was itself the point, as if the goal was for you to understand how much they knew rather than for you to actually learn the thing. Caleb Thornton taught the way someone teaches when they actually want the other person to know how to do it. By mid-morning, she was checking posts on her own while he moved ahead of her down the line. He glanced back once, saw her working steadily, and turned back without comment. She took that as approval. They broke for water at noon, sitting in the narrow shade on the north side of a fence post because it was the only shade available. He handed her the canteen first. She drank and handed it back. The heat was solid and heavy and indifferent to both of them. You catch on quick, he said. She looked at him sideways. It was the longest compliment she'd heard from him, and it was exactly 4 words long. I've had to learn things fast most of my life, she said. There wasn't usually someone around to teach me twice. He looked at her for a moment over the canteen. Your parents? My father passed when I was 12. My mother 2 years after. She took a breath. After that, I went to live with my aunt in Bozeman. She was a practical woman. She taught me to sew, keep accounts, cook. She made sure I could earn my own way. She said. Evelyn paused. She said a woman who can't earn her own way is a woman at the mercy of whatever man happens to be standing nearest when things go wrong. Your aunt was right, Caleb said. She was right about most things. Evelyn looked out at the fence line stretching ahead of them. She died 4 years ago. That's when I started moving around. Looking for a place to land. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then and Harlan Creek was supposed to be that place. I thought so. Her voice stayed even. She'd gotten good at keeping it even. I thought Gerald Morrow was a decent man. I thought keeping honest books and working hard would be enough. She shook her head, just slightly. I was wrong about the first part. You weren't wrong to think it, he said. You were wrong about him. She turned to look at him. He was already looking away, out down the fence line, like he hadn't said anything that warranted a response. But she sat with it for a moment, that small, precise distinction. Not you were naive or that was foolish. Just, you were wrong about him. The error was his to own, not hers. How long since you've been to town, she asked. 3 months, maybe. Do you have friends there? He gave a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I've got a man at the feed store who gives me a fair price on oats and doesn't ask questions. That's about as close as I get. That's lonely. It's quiet, he said. The distinction, she noticed, mattered to him. There's a difference. He stood up, picked up the canteen, and started back down the fence line. Let's finish the north section before the heat gets any worse, he said. She got to her feet and followed him. She didn't push. She'd learned early that a man who'd decided to close a door would only lock it if you tried to force it open. Whatever had made Caleb Thornton retreat to a mountain ranch alone 6 years ago, it was his business until he decided otherwise. But she filed the question away, because the way he'd said quiet, that particular flatness in his voice, that careful blankness told her that quiet and lonely were not, in his case, as different as he wanted to believe. 3 days in, she found the kitchen garden. It was around the south side of the house, half hidden behind an old equipment shed, and it was almost a good garden. The soil was decent. The layout was sensible. But it had been planted by someone who understood the theory of a kitchen garden without quite having the time or attention to make it thrive. Tomatoes were fighting each other for space. The beans needed staking. 3 rows of what might have been carrots had gone to seed without being thinned. She stood there with her hands on her hips and looked at it. Then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn working on a saddle when she came in. Can I ask you something about the garden? You can ask. Did you plant it yourself? 2 years ago, yeah. Have you done anything to it since? He set the saddle tool down and turned to look at her. I water it. But nothing else? I don't have time for anything else. She nodded slowly. I'd like to work on it, if that's all right. It could be producing twice what it is with some attention. Maybe 3 times. He looked at her for a moment. You know gardens? My aunt's garden was the best on her street for 15 years. She paused. I can have yours producing enough that you won't need to buy vegetables at the general store through the fall. Something shifted in his expression, not much, but she was learning to read small shifts. What do you need? Mostly time. A few stakes for the beans. Some twine, and someone to move the water barrel closer to the south side. I can move the barrel. Then I'll start tomorrow morning. She turned to leave. Miss Harper. She stopped. He was looking at her with that measuring expression she'd to recognize, the one that meant he was deciding something about her, revising some internal assessment. You're not what I expected, he said. She raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. He picked the saddle tool back up. Something more defeated. She thought about that for a second. I've been defeated, she said. I just don't find it useful to stay that way. She went back into the house. He moved the barrel that afternoon. The first time she made him laugh was on the 5th day. It was an accident. Entirely, she'd been trying to figure out the temperament of his horse, a big roan gelding named Cassius, who had opinions about everyone and expressed them freely. Caleb had told her Cassius was particular. She had discovered that particular was a significant understatement. She'd gone to give him his morning feed, and Cassius had accepted the hay with the air of someone doing her a favor, then turned his back on her with such deliberate dignity that she had said, out loud, "To a horse you are the most self-important animal I have ever met in my life, and I once worked next door to Gerald Morrow." From behind her, where she hadn't known Caleb was standing, she heard a short, genuine, surprised sound. Not a laugh exactly, a laugh that had startled itself out of him before he could stop it. She spun around. He was in the barn doorway. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you were there." "Cassius," he said, and the flatness of his voice was fighting, with something underneath it. "Has that effect on people?" He looked at me like I owed him money. Caleb pressed his lips together. "Not quite fast enough. He's from good stock. He knows it. He's insufferable is what he is." She turned back to the horse. Cassius swiveled one ear toward her without turning around. "And he knows I said that, too," probably Caleb agreed. She glanced back at him. He'd gotten his expression under control, but something had stayed in it, a looseness around the jaw, a slight brightness she hadn't seen there before. He looked, for about 30 seconds, like a younger version of himself. Like whoever he'd been before 6 years of solitude had set his face into its permanent, careful arrangement. She turned back to Cassius and said nothing about it. But she remembered it. 12 days after she arrived, a rider came up the trail. Caleb saw him from the pasture first and came back to the house at a pace that wasn't quite running, but wasn't his normal steady walk either. Evelyn was on the porch repairing a split seam in one of the ranch hand's work jackets when she saw him coming. She stood up. "Rider coming up the trail," he said, stopping at the porch steps. "You recognize anyone who might come looking for you?" Her stomach went cold. "Gerald Morrow doesn't have anyone who'd come this far." "You sure?" She wasn't sure. She realized she wasn't sure, and the realization moved through her like ice water. "The sheriff," she said. "Dade. He's the only one with any." "It's not Dade," Caleb said. "I know Dade's horse." "This isn't it." He stood at the foot of the porch steps, and they both waited. The rider came through the gate. Caleb had left it unlatched that morning and pulled up in the yard. He was maybe 40, with a sun-weathered face and a deputy's badge catching the light on his chest. Not a deputy Evelyn recognized. "Afternoon," the man said, looking at Caleb. "I'm Deputy Rourke out of Helena. I'm looking for a Caleb Thornton." "You found him. Got a question for you, Mr. Thornton, if you don't mind." Rourke's eyes moved to Evelyn. "And who might this be?" Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't look at Evelyn for guidance or permission or cover. He just said, "My housekeeper, Miss Harper. She's been here 2 weeks." Rourke looked at her for a moment. "Harper," he said flat, testing the sound of it. "Is there something I can help you with, Deputy?" Evelyn asked. "I'll be speaking with Mr. Thornton, ma'am, if you don't mind." He looked back at Caleb. "We've had word out of Harlan Creek. A man named Bill Dyer was seen heading north on the mountain road about 10 days back. Dyer's wanted on a robbery charge out of 2 counties. You seen any strangers come through?" "No. Nobody passing through asking for water, directions?" "Nobody," Caleb said, "except Miss Harper here, and she didn't come from the direction Dyer would have come from." Rourke wrote something in a small notebook. He looked at Evelyn again. "You from Harlan Creek, Miss Harper?" "I was. You know a Gerald Morrow down there?" Something moved behind her sternum. "Yes," she said carefully. "He's been talking to a lot of people about you," Rourke said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't kind either. Just flat and informational. "Word travels. I'm just telling you what I've heard." "I appreciate that." Rourke looked at Caleb. "If you see anyone matching Dyer's description, tall, red-beard secretary on the left hand, you send word to the Helena office." "I'll do that." The deputy wheeled his horse and rode back down the trail. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Evelyn sat back down on the porch step. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. "He knows I'm here," she said. "Morrow. He'll have asked around about where I went." "Probably. If Rourke goes back through Harlan Creek and mentions he found a Harper woman at Thornton's ranch." "Then Morrow knows," Caleb said. "Yes," she looked up at him. "Does that change anything for you?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked down the trail where the deputy had gone, and his jaw was set in that way that meant he was working something internally before he brought it into words. "No," he said finally. "You said it without thinking about it." "I said it after thinking about it," he corrected. "I just think fast." She held his gaze. "You don't have to protect me from this, Mr. Thornton. It isn't your fight." He looked at her then, directly, and something in his expression shifted into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth exactly. Something older than warmth. Something that had been tested and still held. "Nobody's fight stays nobody else's business forever," he said. "Not in this country. Not if you're paying attention." He went back inside. She sat on the porch for a while longer, watching the trail, and tried to figure out when exactly this man had stopped being a stranger. She found the photograph on the 17th day. She hadn't been snooping. She was dusting the sideboard in the front room, which she'd taken on because the layer of dust on it had been approximately structural, and the photograph was sitting there in a simple frame, face forward, not hidden. A formal portrait, Caleb younger by 10 or 15 years, standing beside a boy who looked like a younger, lighter version of him. Both of them in their good clothes. Both of them looking directly at the camera, with the particular stiffness people held in formal portraits, though the boy had a grin pushing through the stiffness, like he couldn't quite suppress it. She dusted the frame carefully and set it back exactly where it had been. That evening after supper, when Caleb was on the porch with his coffee, she came out and sat in the second chair and said, "The photograph on the sideboard. The boy with you, is that your brother?" His hands tightened slightly on the cup. "Was," he said. "His name was Thomas," Caleb said. "He was 22 when he died." He paused. Cattle raiders hit the south pasture. Thomas went out to drive them off. His voice changed, just slightly. "He was always faster to act than to think. I was in town. By the time I got back it was done." Evelyn said nothing. She knew what nothing sometimes was the only thing with enough room in it to hold what someone needed to say. "He'd come up here to help me that summer," Caleb continued. "It was supposed to be temporary. He had a girl in Billings he was planning to go back to." Plans. He said the word like it was a thing that had shown him something specific about itself. "Anyway, after that I stayed on and everyone else left." "The girl?" "Married someone else by the following spring." "I don't blame her." He drank his coffee. People need to live their lives. "And you," Evelyn said quietly, "what did you need?" He looked at her. It was the first time she'd ever asked him a question that aimed directly at him rather than around him, and she watched him decide whether to answer it or deflect it. "At the time," he said, "I needed to not be around people for a while." He turned the cup in his hands. "The while got long. 6 years is a long while." "Yeah." He looked out at the dark shape of the mountain against the night sky. "It is." The silence that came after that was different from the silences earlier in her stay. It had weight to it, but the weight was shared. They were both sitting inside the same quiet, and neither of them was trying to fill it with something easier. She thought, this is what trust feels like when it starts. Not a door swinging open, more like a window, just enough space for the air to move through. 3 weeks in, the seasonal ranch hands arrived. There were 2 of them brothers, Pete and Monroe Alcott, somewhere in their 30s, rough and capable and loud in the uncomplicated way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors with each other. They arrived on a Wednesday morning with their gear and their horses and their noise, and Caleb introduced Evelyn as his housekeeper in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. Pete Alcott tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Monroe Alcott looked at her for slightly longer than was necessary and then looked at Caleb, and some kind of understanding passed between them that Evelyn didn't quite catch but could feel the edges of. She went back inside and let the men settle into their work. That afternoon she heard Monroe say something outside the kitchen window, low and followed by Pete's short laugh. She couldn't make out the words. She told herself it didn't matter. At supper, Caleb put the food on the table, And they all sat, the four of them, and the brothers were talking about the eight they'd found up the north pasture that needed moving, and what the water situation looked like on the east ridge. Normal range talk. She listened and served and said almost nothing. Then Monroe said, "So, Miss Harper, you from around here?" "Originally from Bozeman," she said. "Most recently Harlan Creek." Harlan Creek. He said it like he was tasting it. "You know, we came through Harlan Creek about a month back." She kept her face very still. "Did interesting town," he speared a piece of ham. "Heard some stories down there." Monroe, Caleb said. The word was quiet. It was perfectly quiet, but Monroe went still, the way animals go still when they suddenly understand something about the nature of the thing they're dealing with. "Just making conversation," he said. "You're making something," Caleb said. "It ain't conversation." He looked at Monroe across the table, unhurried. "Miss Harper came up here because she works hard and needed honest work. She does what she said she would, and she does it well. That's all anyone at this table needs to know." Monroe looked at his plate. Pete picked up his fork and said, "Beef looks good tonight," in the tone of a man trying to find higher ground. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He had already turned back to his own food. He ate with the same efficient calm he brought to everything, as if he hadn't, just without raising his voice, without making a scene, without anything dramatic at all, put himself squarely between her and something that could have gone sideways. He didn't look at her. She looked at her plate and felt something in her chest crack slightly open, like a window she'd nailed shut against winter weather and then forgotten to open again when the season changed. She'd been waiting, she realized, for the other shoe. For the moment when his patience with her situation ran out, when the inconvenience of it became too large, when he'd look at her with that flat assessment and say, "This isn't worth the trouble." She'd been waiting for it every day since she arrived, in that low, constant way of someone who's been disappointed so many times they've started getting ready for it before the thing even happens. He hadn't done it. He did the opposite. After supper, when the brothers had gone out to the bunkhouse and she was washing the dishes, he came into the kitchen and refilled his coffee cup and said, without looking at her, "Monroe talks before he thinks. Don't take it personal." "I'm not," she said. "I've heard worse." She paused. "You didn't have to say anything." "I know I didn't have to." She turned from the wash basin to look at him. "Why did you?" He looked at her then, over the rim of his coffee cup, and she waited for him to say something simple and deflecting something about fair treatment or basic decency, the kind of answer that kept the thing at arm's length. Instead, he said, because it was the right thing and nobody else at that table was going to do it. He went back to the porch. She stood at the wash percency for a moment with her wet hands held above the water and thought about what it meant when a man did the right thing without needing to be witnessed doing it, without needing credit for it, without, as far as she could tell, wanting anything back. She'd met very few people like that. She was starting to think she'd underestimated how rare they were. On the 24th day, the letter arrived. One of the Alcott brothers brought it up from the trailhead, where the supply rider had left it, a standard white envelope with her name on the front and no return address, which told her immediately who it was from, before she'd even broken the seal. Gerald Morrow wrote in a neat, clerkish hand that she'd always found slightly menacing in its precision. "Miss Harper, I trust this letter finds you settled comfortably at Mr. Thornton's establishment. I am writing to let you know that the matter of the missing $40 remains unresolved and continues to be a subject of active discussion among the residents of Harlan Creek. I have been generous thus far in my patience. I write now to offer you a final opportunity to return to town and sign the agreement previously offered, which would put the matter to rest to everyone's satisfaction. Should you choose not to accept this final offer, I will have no choice but to pursue the matter through formal legal channels. I am confident the legal system of this territory will view the evidence in a manner consistent with my own assessment. Yours in good faith, G. Morrow." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment. Her first instinct was to handle it alone, She was used to handling things alone. She'd built a whole architecture of self-sufficiency around that particular truth. She didn't ask for help. She didn't bring her problems to other people's doorsteps. She'd walked 31 miles up a mountain because she needed somewhere to land, not because she needed someone to solve her problems for her. She looked at the letter. She looked at the house around her. She thought about Caleb at supper, quiet and certain, saying it ain't conversation in that flat voice that had made Monroe Alcott stare at his plate. She got up and went to find him. He was in the barn, the same place he always was when he wasn't somewhere else on the property. She stood in the doorway, and he looked up from the hay he'd been working and read her face immediately. She could see him do it, that quick assessment that had startled her the first time she'd noticed it. "What happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He read it standing up, which she'd come to understand was how he read everything, like sitting down for it would mean giving it more than it deserved. When he was done, he folded it back the same way she had and held it for a moment. "He says he has evidence," Caleb said. "He has $40 missing from a box in my name." "That's not evidence. In Harlan Creek, with Gerald Morrow and Sheriff Dade, it might be enough." She kept her voice level. "If he files formally, there'll be a hearing. I'll have to go back." Caleb looked at the letter again. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working something out that required him to be precise. "Who keeps accounts at the general store now?" he asked. The question was so specific that it stopped her. "A boy named Carson. Morrow hired him after I left. How old? 17, maybe. And before you, who kept the books?" "Morrow did himself, for years. Until the store got big enough that he didn't have time." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever see anything in those books that looked wrong to you?" She started to say no automatically and then stopped. She stood there in the barn doorway, with the July heat pressing in from all sides, and she thought about a specific afternoon 9 months ago, when she'd been going through the quarterly figures and found a line item that didn't quite add up. She'd assumed she'd made an error. She'd recalculated. The numbers still didn't sit right. She'd brought it tomorrow, and he'd taken the ledger from her and said he'd check it himself and come back to her the next day, with a correction that had seemed at the time plausible. "Once," she said slowly, "there was one time I found a number I couldn't make balance." Caleb looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Focused, intent, like something had just come into alignment. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which she'd noticed was a habit of his, waiting until the whole thing was out before he said a word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, if Morrow's been running irregular numbers through his own books, and he hired someone who was good enough to notice, he'd want to get rid of them before they figured out what they'd found, Evelyn said. The pieces of it arranged themselves in front of her as she said it, clean and cold and awful. "He didn't frame me because I took anything. He framed me because I was getting close to finding what he'd taken." The barn was very quiet. Cassius, in his stall, shifted his weight and blew out a long breath, as if even the horse understood the gravity of what had just been said. Caleb handed the letter back to her. His face was absolutely still, the way a mountain is still, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening too deep down to see from the surface. "I know a man in Helena," he said, "a lawyer named Aldridge. He's honest. He's expensive, but he stop. I've got enough put by." Evelyn stared at him. "I'm not asking you to pay for a lawyer, Mr. Thornton. I know you're not asking. You can't spend that kind of money on." "On what?" he said. She stopped. "On what?" he said again, quieter this time. Not challenging, just asking her to finish the sentence. She couldn't finish the sentence, because the end of it was "on me." And standing here in the barn door, with the letter in her hand, and the sudden vast weight of what she'd just understood about Gerald Morrow, and the whole ugly machinery of what had been done to her, standing here with that, she couldn't make a case for why it was unreasonable for someone to be willing to help her. It isn't your problem, she finally said, weaker than she intended. No, he agreed, it isn't. He picked up the hay fork again, like the matter was settled. I'm going to write to Aldridge tomorrow. If Morrow wants to go legal, we'll go legal, and we'll go with someone who knows what they're doing. She stood in the doorway. Caleb, she said. He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and they both registered it. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his face, brief and complicated, and not quite anything she had a word for yet. Go finish the garden before you lose the light, he said. She went. But she walked back to the garden with something new settled in her chest, something that sat there steadily and quietly and took up the exact shape of the space that fear had been occupying. And it wasn't gratitude exactly. And it wasn't hope exactly, and she didn't have a name for it yet. She thought she might, eventually. Aldridge's letter arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after Caleb had sent his own. Evelyn was in the garden when Pete Alcott came around the side of the house with the envelope and said, "Supply rider brought this up, Miss Harper. Says it's marked urgent." She pulled off her work gloves and took it. The envelope was heavy, good paper, with the return address of one William Aldridge, attorney at law, Helena, Montana Territory. She turned it over in her hands and then brought it straight to the barn, where Caleb was working, because it wasn't her letter even though her name was in it. And because she'd learned in the past month that the things that mattered most were better faced with someone standing next to you than alone. He read it without sitting down, same as always. When he was done, he read it a second time. Then he looked at her. Aldridge says Morrow filed last week, he said. It's formal now. There's a hearing date set for the first week of September. Harlan Creek Circuit Court. She'd known it was coming. She'd known since the letter. Knowing it and hearing the date were two different things, and she felt them differently in her body, one in her mind, one somewhere lower and harder to manage. 6 weeks, she said. He folded the letter. Aldridge also says he's been asking around. He knows people in Harlan Creek, a clerk at the land office who owes him a favor. He says Morrow's been expanding, buying up parcels along the South Creek route. 3 purchases in the last 2 years, all of them underpriced. She went still. Aldridge's word is suspiciously. He thinks the money in Morrow's books might not have started with the cash box. He paused. He thinks it started earlier, and he thinks it went somewhere specific. The land, Evelyn said, the land, Caleb confirmed. She thought about those quarterly figures, that one afternoon, 9 months ago, sitting at Morrow's desk in the back room of the store, going through the numbers and finding something that refused to balance. She thought about how Morrow had taken the ledger from her hands. How he'd smiled when he did it. How she'd thought at the time that the smile was just his manner. He knew I'd found it, she said. He knew right then. Probably. He didn't fire me because that would have raised questions. He waited. She said it out loud to hear how it sounded, and it sounded exactly as cold as it was. He built the case, waited for a moment when he could frame it so completely that nobody would look past the surface. A woman alone, Caleb said. No witnesses. It's a clean frame if you don't look too hard. Sheriff Dade didn't look at all. Dade might not be entirely independent, Caleb said. His voice had gone flat and careful. Aldridge hints at it. He doesn't say it directly, but it's in the letter. Evelyn sat down on an overturned feed bucket because her legs had made the decision for her. She looked at the middle distance and felt the shape of the thing. Morrow had done to her the full shape of it, not just the piece she'd been able to see from inside it. He hadn't just accused her. He'd built a machine that ran on the simple fuel of a woman alone in a town full of people who already knew his name better than they knew hers. I need to go to Helena, she said. We need to go to Helena, Caleb said. She looked up at him. Aldridge needs to meet you in person, he said. And I've got some things to tell him that aren't in any letter. What things? He looked at her steadily. I knew a man who sold one of those parcels tomorrow. Ben Ferris. He runs sheep about 20 miles east of here. I've known him 15 years. If Morrow pressured Ferris into that sale the way I think he might have, Ferris will say so to a man he trusts. He paused. He won't say it to a stranger, and he won't say it to a lawyer. But he might say it to me. She stared at him. You've been thinking about this. Since the letter. You didn't say anything. I wasn't sure enough to say anything. He tucked Aldridge's letter inside his vest. Now I am. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines. Pete Alcott was saying something to his brother at the far end of the yard, some ordinary working-day exchange that belonged to an ordinary world where men weren't systematically destroyed by the people who held their accounts. Evelyn looked at Caleb, this man who'd aimed a rifle at her the first day, who'd told her she could stay until morning and then stayed himself at the kitchen table long past midnight the first week, going through the mending she'd piled up. Who'd said it ain't conversation to Monroe Alcott in a voice like a door closing on something that had no business being open, and she thought about what it meant that he'd been quietly building a case on her behalf for. Weeks without saying a word about it until he was sure. You are, she said slowly, not at all what I thought you were going to be. He almost did it again, almost let something real get through the front of his expression. She was getting better at catching those moments. I'll arrange the trip, he said. We can leave Monday. They left Monday before dawn. The ride to Helena took most of 2 days. They stopped overnight at a way station between the mountain road and the valley, a plain practical place run by a practical woman who asked no questions and charged fair rates, which Caleb paid without discussion. Evelyn offered to pay half, and he said, "We'll settle accounts when the whole thing's settled," which she recognized as his version of not now. She let it go. The second day on the road was easier. They'd found, over 6 weeks at the ranch, a rhythm of being together that didn't require constant navigation. They could ride for 2 hours in comfortable silence, and then fall into conversation as naturally as if there'd been no pause. She'd stopped being careful about what she said around him somewhere around week 3. He'd stopped being careful around her somewhere. Earlier than that, she thought, though she hadn't quite caught the exact moment. Tell me about Thomas, she said, around mid-morning of the second day. He looked at the road ahead for a moment. He was funny, Caleb said. That's the thing people always forget when someone's gone. They remember the serious parts. Thomas was genuinely funny. He could make anybody laugh, even people who didn't want to. Even me, and I didn't want to most of the time. He paused. He used to say I'd been born at 40 and was working my way backward. Evelyn smiled at the road. He sounds like someone who was very easy to love, she said. He was, Caleb said simply. He was the easiest person I ever knew. She thought about her own losses, her parents, her aunt, the small accumulated abandonments of a life, lived mostly without the infrastructure of family. She thought about the particular weight of losing someone who made the world more navigable, just by being in it. I'm sorry, she said, that you lost him. He glanced at her. Just briefly. I know, he said, and the way he said it meant he actually believed she was. William Aldridge was a small, precise man in his 50s, with steel-rimmed glasses and the particular quality of attention that came from decades of listening to people tell him true things and false things, and trying to figure out which was which. He met them at his office on a Wednesday morning and shook Evelyn's hand first, which she noted. He asked her questions for 2 hours. He asked her about the books, about the specific entry she'd found that didn't balance, about the date, the amount, the ledger column it had appeared in. He asked her to write down everything she could remember about Morrow's bookkeeping system, how he organized it, which columns he used for which categories, where the irregularities would show if someone knew what to look for. She answered everything. When she was done, Aldridge took his glasses off, cleaned them, put them back on, and said, Miss Harper, I want to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your answer won't change the quality of my representation. Do you understand? Yes. Did you take that $40? No, she said. He nodded once. I didn't think so. but I needed to hear you say it." He looked at Caleb. "And you, Mr. Thornton, you're willing to testify to Miss Harper's character." "I'm willing to testify to what I know," Caleb said. "And to what Ben Ferris told me." Aldridge looked up sharply. "You spoke to Ferris?" "Yesterday on the way through." He talked. Caleb laid his hat on the edge of the desk. "Morrow told Ferris his land was being assessed for a new road route that would cut the property's value in half. It was a lie, but Ferris didn't know that. He sold at a loss to avoid the road. 2 weeks later, the road assessment never happened. Morrow bought the land for pennies and turned it for a profit inside a year." Aldridge stared at him. "Ferris will say that in a courtroom," he said. "Ferris will say that anywhere anyone asks him," Caleb said. "He's been sitting on it for 2 years because he didn't think anybody would believe him over Morrow. He'll talk to you now." Aldridge was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen, uncapped it, and said, "Let me explain something to you both about what this changes." What it changed was significant. Aldridge explained it in the careful, measured language of someone accustomed to making legal concepts, land with people who didn't speak legal, which Evelyn appreciated. The Ferris situation transformed the framing of Morrow's case against her, from a straightforward theft accusation to part of a pattern. It wasn't just that Evelyn hadn't taken $40. It was that Gerald Morrow was a man with a documented history of manipulating financial situations to eliminate threats to his own irregularities. "I need to be honest with you," Aldridge said, looking between them. "This is a good position. It is not a guaranteed position. Morrow has money, and in this territory money purchases a considerable amount of credibility. Sheriff Dade will testify on his behalf. There will likely be 2 or 3 other witnesses from Harlan Creek who will confirm Morrow's account." He paused. "And a circuit court judge in a small town sometimes sees what the town wants him to see." "Then we make sure he sees more than the town wants," Caleb said. Aldridge looked at him steadily. "That's exactly what I intend to do, Mr. Thornton." He capped his pen. "I need 6 weeks. The hearing date works in our favor. It gives me time to subpoena the store ledgers and get a proper account done by someone who knows what to look for." He looked at Evelyn. "Do you remember enough about the bookkeeping to tell an accountant where to look?" "I can do better than that," she said. "I remember the exact entry. I can describe the format down to the column headers." Aldridge allowed himself a small smile. "Then I believe we have a case, Miss Harper." She held herself together through the rest of the meeting. She held herself together on the walk out of the office, down the front steps, across the street to where their horses were tied. She held herself together until they'd ridden 2 full blocks away from Aldridge's office. Then she stopped her horse at the side of the road and put both hands flat on the saddle horn and leaned forward and just breathed for a moment. Caleb stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. He just waited, his horse patient beside hers, while she breathed through the thing that was moving through her. Relief and fear and anger, all arriving at once, the way emotions do when they've been held in one place too long, and suddenly there's a door open. "He believes me," she said finally. "I know. A man who does this for a living, who's heard every kind of story, looked at all of it," and she stopped. "I've been so afraid that I'd start talking, and people would look at me the way Dade looked at me. Like I was the problem. Like the story I was telling was the story about me, rather than the story being done to me." "Aldridge isn't Dade," Caleb said. "No." She sat up straighter. "No, he isn't." She looked at Caleb. "Thank you for bringing me here. For knowing to bring me here." He tipped his hat brim slightly. That minimal gesture she'd come to understand was his version of "you're welcome." "And also, I'm not going to make a big thing of this, but I mean it." "Let's find somewhere to eat," he said. "And then we head back tomorrow." She nodded. They rode on. It was on the ride back that she realized, with the particular clarity that comes from being somewhere unfamiliar with someone you've been learning to trust, that the shape of what she felt about Caleb Thornton no longer fit inside the category of gratitude. She didn't say anything about it. She wasn't reckless and she wasn't naive. She knew how new it was. She knew that what she'd built at the ranch over 6 weeks was real but not yet old enough to lean on too hard. She knew that Caleb Thornton was a man who'd spent 6 years deciding that keeping people at a distance was the safest form of living, and that things that grow in the opposite direction of their habit grow slowly, or they break. She said nothing. She filed it away with everything else she understood about the situation and let it be what it was. But she knew. The trouble came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks after they returned from Helena, on a Saturday afternoon when the Alcott brothers were in town, and Caleb was up at the north pasture checking the cattle, a wagon came up the trail. Evelyn was on the porch when she heard it. She looked up and watched it come through the gate, a proper town wagon, black with a canvas cover, the kind that meant someone had come prepared to wait. The man driving it was Gerald Morrow. She stood up from the porch chair. He was heavier than she remembered, which was somehow the first thing she noticed, heavier and redder in the face, a man who'd eaten well on other people's losses. He was dressed in his good suit. He had a second man with him on the wagon seat, someone she didn't recognize, broad and expressionless. Morrow climbed down from the wagon with the particular care of a man who intended to project authority and didn't want to stumble to ruin it. He straightened his jacket, looked at the house, looked at the porch, and saw her. He smiled. "Miss Harper," he said, "you're looking well." "Mountain air seems to agree with you." She said nothing. "I wonder if I might have a word." He looked around the property with the assessing look of a man pricing things. "And perhaps a word with Mr. Thornton, if he's about." "He's not," she said. "What do you want, Mr. Morrow?" He walked closer, stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. The smile stayed on his face, but nothing behind it was smiling. "I want to offer you one more opportunity to settle this quietly," he said, "before it gets to a courtroom and becomes something neither of us can control. I control my side of it just fine. You've engaged a lawyer." He said it pleasantly, like a man reporting weather. "Aldridge. Respectable firm. He's been asking questions about my business, which I'm sure you knew he would be." He tilted his head. "I understand you've been to Helena. I understand you spoke to Ben Ferris." She kept her face still. "I did." "Ben Ferris is a confused old man who misremembered a routine business transaction," Morrow said, and the pleasantness didn't budge. "That is what he will say under oath, Miss Harper, because that is what he will be advised to say. And a jury looking at Ben Ferris's word against mine will find his memory considerably less reliable than mine." "What are you actually offering?" she said. He spread his hands. "Drop the legal engagement. Withdraw from the hearing. Sign the original agreement, admit the $40, work it off, and I will ensure that no further mention is made of your name in Harlan Creek in any context that damages your prospects. You can start fresh somewhere without this hanging over you." "And if I don't?" The pleasantness finally shifted. Just slightly, like a mask moved a quarter inch to the left, and you could see the edge of what was under it. "Then I will be thorough," he said. "I will make sure that every person in a position to employ a woman named Evelyn Harper in this territory knows exactly what the court of Harlan Creek decided about her character. I will be very, very thorough, Miss Harper. I have the time and the means." She looked at him. She'd been afraid of Gerald Morrow from the moment he'd taken that ledger out of her hands and smiled at her. She'd been afraid of him in Harlan Creek, and on the road, and in the night, and in the quiet moments at the ranch, when the weight of what he'd done to her landed fresh. She had carried that fear for months like a stone in her chest. She looked at him standing at the foot of the porch steps in his good suit, and she took the measure of him, this man who'd built a machine to destroy her, because she'd found a number that didn't balance, and something shifted inside her. Something that had been compressed for a long time straightened out. "No," she said. He blinked. "I will not sign your agreement," she said. "I will not withdraw from the hearing, and I will see you in that courtroom in 3 weeks, and Mr. Aldridge will put every one of your ledgers in front of a judge and let him see what a man with time and means does with other people's land and other people's reputations. She took one step forward, to the edge of the porch. I am done being your convenient explanation, Mr. Morrow. I am done. He stared at her. The silence lasted about 5 seconds, which was long enough for her to notice the second man on the wagon watching them with flat, careful attention, and long enough for her to hear, from behind and to her right, the sound of boots on the dry ground coming from the direction of the North Trail. She didn't look, but she knew. Morrow looked past her shoulder. His expression changed not much, but she caught it. Caleb came around the side of the house. He walked at his normal pace, unhurried, which she had learned was the pace of a man who did not feel threatened, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps beside her. He looked at Morrow. He looked at the man on the wagon. Thornton, Morrow said, recovering his pleasantness. I was just speaking with Miss Harper. I heard you, Caleb said. The pleasant tone faltered slightly. You were. Far enough up the trail that you didn't see me come back, Caleb said. Not far enough that I couldn't hear. He looked at Morrow steadily. The way he looked at fence lines he was assessing, measuring, calculating, determining what needed to be done. You've had your answer. She gave it to you. I'd recommend taking it. Mr. Thornton, I have no quarrel with you. This is a civil matter between. You came onto my property, Caleb said, without invitation. To threaten a woman in my household. He let that settle for a moment. That makes it my business. She is not Morrow. Stop. Started again. The woman is your employee, Thornton. She is not your she is, Caleb said, exactly who I say she is. And what I say is that she told you no and you should leave now. Morrow looked at him for a long moment. He was calculating, she could see it, the way a man calculates odds when the odds are shifting. Morrow understood money and leverage and the machinery of reputation. He understood those tools. He did not, she thought, entirely understand the man standing at the bottom of these porch steps looking at him like a problem that had a very simple solution. You're making an error, Morrow said, aligning yourself with her publicly. People in town will I know what people in town will say, Caleb said. I found out a long time ago that what people in town say costs me exactly nothing. He tilted his head slightly toward the gate. Goodbye, Mr. Morrow. Morrow stood there for another beat. Then he turned and walked back to the wagon. He climbed up with that same careful dignity, straightened his jacket again, and said to the expressionless man beside him, something too low to hear. The wagon turned. Caleb and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched it go down the trail. When it was out of sight, Caleb said, Did he threaten you directly? He was very polished about it, she said. But yes. We need to write to Aldridge today. Everything he said, as close to word for word as you can remember it. Offers of settlement before a hearing, delivered in person without legal representation present, are something Aldridge will want to know about. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the trail, jaw set, not performing calm so much as actually being it, that steadiness of his, that wasn't absence of feeling but something more like feeling with deep roots. You heard all of it, she said. Most of it. You let me answer him. He looked at her then. You didn't need me to answer him, he said. You were doing fine. She had been doing fine. She knew that. But she also knew that Caleb Thornton had stood there beside her on those steps, not in front, not behind, directly beside, and let her face the man who'd destroyed her life on her own terms, and had been there as the fixed point at her back the whole time. The second man on the wagon, she said. Did you recognize him? Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Name's Cord Beller. He does work for various people in the county that doesn't get talked about in polite company. She felt the cold move through her. He brought Beller. He brought Beller, Caleb confirmed. She processed that. The implication of it. Morrow hadn't driven up this mountain road for a negotiation. He'd driven up with a man whose job was making problems disappear in whatever manner was necessary, And he'd left without her signature and without the outcome he'd come for. "He'll try something else," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "He will. Do you think he'll wait for the hearing?" "I think Morrow is a man who plans ahead and a man who prefers clean solutions. A hearing with Aldridge involved is not a clean solution for him anymore." Caleb looked at her directly. "I think we don't have 3 weeks." She held his gaze. "What do we do? Tonight," he said. "We write that letter to Aldridge. Tell him everything, Morrow Beller. The offer, the threat." He paused. "And I'm going to send word to the Alcott brothers to come back from town tonight rather than tomorrow. Because I don't want to be the only set of eyes on this property right now." She understood what he was saying. She understood it with the specific, unpleasant clarity of someone who just had a man with a polished smile and a dangerous companion climb down from a wagon on her porch. "All right," she said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table, found paper and pen, and started writing. She wrote everything she remembered, every word of Morrow's, the tone, the smile, the moment the smile slipped. She wrote about Beller. She wrote it all in the clear, precise accountant's hand that had gotten her into this situation in the first place, and was now, she intended, going to help get her out of it. Caleb sat across from her and wrote his own account. They worked at the table in the evening light, the scratch of 2 pens the only sound in the house, until the letters were done. He sealed them. She addressed them. "I want to say something," she said. He looked up. "When he was talking to me before you came around the corner, I was afraid." She kept her voice even. "Not the same fear I had when I first came up here. I knew what he'd come to do. I understood exactly what he was capable of." She looked at the letter in her hands. "And I still said no. I want you to know that I would have said no regardless." "I know that," Caleb said. "I don't want you to think that you standing there is what made me able to say it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think that," he said. "What I think is that you would have said no alone on this porch if I'd been 50 miles away. And I think it mattered that you didn't have to be." He held her gaze. "Both things can be true." She looked at him. "Caleb Thornton. The man who'd aimed a rifle at her the first afternoon and given her water and a room and an honest wage and a place to stand when the thing that had been hunting her finally showed its face at the gate. The man who'd said not your fight and made it his anyway. The man who'd said both things can be true in a voice that didn't require anything back from her." "Yes," she said quietly. "They can." She stood up and took the letters to be sealed, and outside that July darkness had settled over the mountain fully now, the kind of dark that had stars in it, and wind, and the distant sound of cattle, and nothing else for miles in every direction. And somewhere down that trail, a wagon with a man in a good suit and a man with flat eyes was making its way back toward town. And whatever came next was coming. She had stopped being afraid of that. She was ready. The Alcott brothers came back that night. Pete arrived first, around 9, coming through the gate with his horse at a trot, and his expression already reading the weight of the situation from the look on Caleb's face. Monroe was 20 minutes behind him, quieter than usual, which Evelyn had learned meant he was paying attention. Caleb told them what had happened in exactly the number of words required, and no more. Morrow, Beller, the offer, the refusal. What Beller's presence meant. Pete said, "You want us on rotation tonight?" "I want eyes on the gate and the south approach. From now until the hearing," Caleb said. "Beller doesn't do anything clean. He'll want it to look like an accident or a natural problem. Fire, maybe. Spooked cattle. Something that explains itself." Monroe said nothing for a moment, then Miss Harper. He said her name differently than he had that first week at supper, no edge in it now, just a man saying a name that had come to mean something specific to him. "I want to say something to you." She looked at him. "What I said that first week," he said. "What I implied. I was wrong to do it, and I knew it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway, which makes it worse." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry for it." She looked at him steadily. "Apology accepted, Mr. Alcott." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and said to Caleb, "I'll take the first watch." That was that. Evelyn went to bed that night knowing there were 3 men between her and the trail, and she still didn't sleep well, but the not sleeping was different. It wasn't the sick, hollow vigilance of a person who is alone with a threat. It was the tighter, more purposeful not sleeping of a person who is part of something and knows what the next day requires. She was up before all of them. Aldridge's response came back in 4 days, which was fast for any male, and said something about how seriously he was taking it. He'd received their accounts of Morrow's visit. He was filing an affidavit with the circuit court, documenting the pre-hearing contact and the implicit intimidation. He'd already spoken to Ferris again, in person this time, and Ferris had confirmed everything. He had also, and this was the part that made Caleb read the letter a second time and then set it on the table and look at it, he had also received, from his contact at the Helena Land Office, documentation of 3 separate property transactions involving Morrow over the past 4 years, all of which showed the same pattern: artificially depressed purchase prices, false assessments. One of them, the Carver parcel on the South Creek route, had involved a letter from Sheriff Dade's office confirming a road assessment that had never been formally commissioned. Dade wasn't just indifferent, Dade was involved. Caleb looked up from the letter. Evelyn was across the table watching his face. "How bad?" she said. He handed her the letter. She read it. Her expression didn't change much. She had, he'd noticed, a remarkable ability to receive difficult information without performing her reaction to it. She just let it land and then sat with it. "Dade," she said. "Dade," he confirmed. "That's why the investigation went nowhere." There was no investigation. She set the letter down. "Dade knew from the beginning. Aldridge thinks so." "Does he think Dade will face charges?" "He doesn't say that directly." Caleb looked at the letter. "But he says he's forwarding everything to the federal marshal's office in Helena." He paused. "That's not something you do over a small-town theft accusation." She understood what that meant. A federal marshal's interest meant the scope of what Morrow had done was larger than one woman's $40 and one old man's land. It meant it had been going on long enough and wide enough to be worth the federal government's attention. It meant she'd stumbled, by doing her job too well, into something that had roots much deeper than she'd seen from the inside. He could still win the hearing, she said, locally. Even with all of this. He could, Caleb agreed. Aldridge isn't promising otherwise. "Then we still go," she nodded. Her hands were flat on the table. He looked at her hands, the calluses she'd developed over 2 months of ranch work, the ink stain on her right index finger, from 4 days of writing letters. She'd come up this mountain with 3 items in a canvas bag, and she'd built herself into something here. Something rooted. He thought about that. He thought about it more than was strictly practical. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "If Dade is involved, he knows Aldridge is moving. He'll tell Morrow." She looked at Caleb. "We have less time than we thought, and we already thought we didn't have much." He'd reached the same conclusion about 30 seconds ahead of her. "I know. Then we need to decide something." "What's that?" She looked at him directly, the way she did when she'd already made up her mind about something, and was bringing him into it rather than asking his permission. He'd come to respect that particular look enormously. "I think we should go to Harlan Creek before the hearing," she said. "Not to hide in it. To walk into it. Let people see that I'm still standing and I'm not afraid and I've got someone standing with me." She paused. "Morrow built his case on me being invisible, on nobody seeing me or speaking for me. I want to undo that before a judge has to." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's either very smart," he said, "or it's the kind of thing that hands Morrow a weapon." "I know." She didn't look away. "Which do you think it is?" He considered it honestly, the way she deserved to have it considered. Harlan Creek on Morrow's home ground, with Dated's badge and Morrow's relationships and 2 years of carefully cultivated reputation. Walking in there before the hearing could read as confident, or it could read as desperate, depending on who was doing the reading and what they'd already been told. But Evelyn Harper had walked 31 miles up a mountain road in July heat and stood at his gate without begging. She'd told Monroe Alcott her name like it was a thing she was proud of. She'd looked at Gerald Morrow on these porch steps and said no in a voice that didn't shake. He knew what she was, he said, if we do it right. She allowed herself a small, tight breath. Tell me what right looks like. We go in during the day, Main Street. We go to the general store, not Morrow's, the other one, Hallett's, and we conduct ordinary business. We're visible. We don't make speeches. We don't confront anyone. He paused. We let them see you whole. Let them do their own reconsidering. And if Dade approaches us, then we're cordial and we go about our business, his jaw set. He can't arrest you for shopping, Evelyn. The name came out naturally. He'd been calling her Miss Harper in his head for weeks out of habit, and out of the particular care he took with things that mattered. And somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the habit had simply stopped. She noticed. He saw her notice. Neither of them said anything about it. When, she said. Thursday, he said. That gives Aldridge time to file the affidavit before we go in. Thursday, she agreed. She picked up the letter and folded it and said, I'm going to go weed the tomatoes, which was the most ordinary thing possible and also, he thought, exactly right. The ability to face something hard and then go do the next ordinary thing was not a small ability. He'd seen people without it fall apart in much smaller circumstances than this. He watched her go. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a while with his coffee gone cold and thought about the word he'd used without planning to, and what it meant that it had come out of him so easily. And whether he was in any shape to do anything useful with that information. He wasn't sure yet, but he was getting there. Thursday came hot and clear. They rode into Harlan Creek at 10 in the morning, Caleb on Cassius and Evelyn on the gray mare she'd been riding since her 4th week on the ranch, a calmer animal than Cassius, with a steadier temperament and no opinions about her social standing. The main street of Harlan Creek was doing its ordinary Thursday business. The dry goods store was open, the bank, Hallett's general store, the barber, the woman who did laundry out of her house on the corner. People moving in and out of doorways, doing the ordinary machinery of a small town morning. They registered. Evelyn had expected that, had prepared herself for it, but the reality of it was something different. The way people on the boardwalk stepped back slightly. The way conversations dropped. The way 3 women coming out of the dressmaker's shop stopped and then looked away. She kept her back straight and her face even. Caleb rode beside her without looking at anyone specifically, which she understood was deliberate. He wasn't scanning the street for reactions. He was simply being present, unhurried, in the way of a man who had decided to be somewhere, and was not interested in anyone's opinion of that decision. They tied the horses in front of Hallett's and went inside. Robert Hallett was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a careful manner. He looked up when they came in, and something moved across his face: recognition, calculation, and then, almost imperceptibly, decision. Mr. Thornton, he said. It's been a while, it has, Caleb agreed. I need some items, Mr. Hallett, and I believe Miss Harper has a list of her own. Hallett looked at Evelyn. Miss Harper, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not the same as the boardwalk outside. Something more careful. It's good to see you. She met his eyes. And you, Mr. Hallett. They did their shopping. It took 20 minutes, and it was the most deliberate she could remember, spending in her life every exchange at the counter, every response to Hallett's questions about ranch supply needs. Conducted with the particular normalcy of 2 people who were in fact behaving entirely normally, and were aware that every word was being absorbed by every person in earshot. There were 4 other people in the store. She didn't look at them directly. She didn't need to. When they were done, Hallett wrapped their parcels and said quietly, while Caleb was loading the packages, "For what it's worth, Miss Harper, there are people in this town who've had their own questions about the way things went, who haven't said so publicly. He paused. Who might, given the opportunity, say so differently. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate you telling me that, Mr. Hallett. Gerald Morrow does a great deal of business in this town, he said. But he isn't the only one who does business in this town. He handed her the last parcel. Good day, ma'am. She came out onto the boardwalk into the full weight of the Thursday sun and found Caleb loading the saddlebags and Pete Alcott, who'd followed them in at a distance, as Caleb had arranged, standing across the street with his horse, watching the street with casual attention that wasn't casual at all. Then she heard the door of the sheriff's office open. Dade was a heavy man, 50 or so, with a badge that caught the light and eyes that had learned, over years of choosing the easier side of things, to look at people without quite seeing them. He came down the 2 steps from the office and crossed the street toward them with his thumbs in his belt and his face set in the expression of a man performing authority. Thornton, he said. He barely looked at Evelyn. Heard you were in town. Just doing some business, Caleb said. He didn't stop organizing the saddlebag. Miss Harper. Dade looked at her now, and it was the look she remembered from his office 2 months ago, flat, dismissive, the look of a man who had already decided what she was and found continuing to look at her an inconvenience. Didn't expect to see you back here. I live in Montana Territory, Sheriff, she said pleasantly. I'm permitted to move around in it. Dade's eyes went back to Caleb. You're aware there's an active civil matter pending against you. He paused deliberately. Your housekeeper. I'm aware, Caleb said. She has legal representation. The matter is proceeding through the appropriate channels. He finally looked at Dade directly. Is there something I can help you with, Sheriff? Dade held his gaze for a moment. He was calculating the same thing Morrow had calculated on the porch, the nature of the man he was dealing with. Whether the mountain quiet of Caleb Thornton was the quiet of a man who would be moved. It wasn't, and Dade was experienced enough to recognize that. Just keeping aware of my town's business, Dade said. Then I'd say you're doing your job, Caleb said pleasantly. Good day, Sheriff. Dade stood there for another beat. Then he turned and walked back across the street to his office. Evelyn let out a very slow, very controlled breath. That was Dade keeping tabs, Caleb said quietly, finishing with the saddlebag. He'll report back tomorrow within the hour. Good, she said. He looked at her. Good? Let Morrow know I came back to town and walked down his main street and bought flour at the competition and spoke to the sheriff, and nobody arrested me and nobody ran me off. She checked the cinch on the gray mare with the competence she'd built over 2 months of learning. Let him think about what that means for his story about me. Caleb looked at her for a moment, with that expression she'd come to know, the one that meant he was revising something upward. Then he put his foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Cassius. Let's go home, he said. She registered the word. Home. He'd said it without thinking. She could tell by the slight pause after it, the fractional moment of him registering it too. She got up onto the gray mare and didn't say anything about it. But she kept it. The twist came 9 days before the hearing, and it came from the direction none of them had fully anticipated. It came from inside Morrow's own store. A young man appeared at the ranch gate on a Tuesday evening, the boy named Carson, the 17-year-old who'd been keeping Morrow's accounts since Evelyn left. He was pale and sweat-damp, and he'd ridden up the trail fast enough that his horse needed cooling down. Caleb met him at the gate. Evelyn came out onto the porch when she heard the horse. I need to speak to Miss Harper, the boy said. His voice was trying to be steady and not quite managing it. Please. I know it's late and I know I've got no right to ask, but please. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She came down from the porch. Carson. The boy turned to her. He was young enough that the thing he was feeling was completely visible on his face, guilt and fear in equal portions, and underneath them something that was trying to be courage and finding it harder than he'd expected. I found something, he said, in the book. The same thing you found, I think. I've been going over and over it for 3 weeks, trying to figure out if I was reading it wrong. He looked at her with eyes that were asking her to tell him she understood what he was risking by being here. Miss Harper, I think I've got proof. Not just what you remember. I kept copies of 3 ledger pages. The ones that don't match the receipts. The porch went very quiet. Evelyn said carefully, "Does Mr. Morrow know you have them?" "No, ma'am." "Does anyone know you're here?" "No, ma'am." I told my mother I was riding to see a friend. She looked at him for a long moment, this boy who'd taken a position after her, who'd walked into the same room and found the same thing, and had understood, somehow, what it meant for someone else. "Why are you bringing this to me?" she said. His jaw tightened. "Because when I found it, I went to Mr. Morrow and told him I thought I'd found an error." "The same as you probably did." He swallowed. He smiled at me. "He took the ledger and he said he'd look into it." He looked down at his horse's mane. "I went home that night and I thought about what happened to you. And I thought if I just let this go, then what happened to you happened for nothing." Evelyn pressed her lips together. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you." They sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn, Caleb, and Carson, with the 3 copied ledger pages spread out under the lamp. Carson had done good work. The copies were precise, careful, made by someone who understood what he was copying, even if he hadn't been certain why. 3 pages, each from a different quarter, each with a pattern of discrepancies that lined up with the land purchase dates Aldridge had identified. Caleb sat with his arms on the table and looked at the pages without touching them. "You understand," he said to Carson, "that you'll need to testify to where these came from and how you got them." "Yes, sir. In a court oath. In front of Morrow." The boy's throat moved. "Yes, sir, I know. You could lose your position." "I think," Carson said, "that I'm going to lose it either way. If I stay quiet and Morrow finds out I knew, and he'll find out eventually, I lose it then. At least this way it means something." Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the pages. Her eyes were doing something complicated, moving across the columns of numbers, recognizing them, understanding exactly what they meant, and also understanding what this boy had risked to put them in front of her. "We need to get these to Aldridge tomorrow," she said. "First thing." "I'll ride tonight," Caleb said. "Get ahead of the morning." "I'll go with you," Evelyn said. "You'll stay here where I can." He stopped. She looked at him. He said it differently. "I'd rather you stayed here. With the Alcotts. Until I'm back." She understood what he wasn't saying. If Morrow had Dade watching the ranch, and if Dade saw them both ride out at night, there was no one here with authority to keep things calm. The Alcotts were capable men, but 2 men on a property at night were more defensible than an empty property. "All right," she said. "You go, I'll be here." He stood up and looked at Carson. "You're staying the night. We're not sending you back down that trail in the dark." The boy didn't argue. Caleb was saddled and moving inside 20 minutes. Evelyn stood at the gate and watched him go the shape of him on Cassius, disappearing into the dark of the trail, and felt something move through her that she didn't entirely have language for yet. It wasn't worry exactly. She knew he could handle himself on that road. It was something closer to the particular vulnerability of having let someone matter enough that the sight of them riding away from you in the dark means something in your body. She went back inside. She sat with Carson at the kitchen table and made him eat something, and asked him careful questions about the ledger system, and wrote everything he told her in her clear accountant's hand. Because Aldridge would need the testimony shaped before the hearing, and she had 8 days, and she was going to use every one of them. She worked until almost 2 in the morning, then she put out the lamp and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to the mountain. Caleb came back the following afternoon with Aldridge himself. She hadn't expected that. She heard the horses and came out onto the porch, and there were 2 of them coming through the gate, and she felt the thing in her chest rearrange itself with relief so strong it almost embarrassed her. Aldridge dismounted and said, "Before anything else, Miss Harper, these documents are significant. I want you to understand how significant. They establish a pattern across 4 years that is no longer arguable as coincidence." He came up the porch steps with the energy of a man who'd been given a better hand than he'd expected and knew exactly how to play it. "We are no longer defending you against a theft accusation. We are prosecuting a fraud." "We're not the prosecution," she said carefully. "Not formally." He almost smiled. "But with what the boy brought you, and what I already had, and what I'm sending to the federal marshal's office this week, the burden of this hearing has shifted significantly. Morrow will arrive at that courtroom expecting to finish what he started 2 months ago." He paused. "He is going to be considerably surprised." Caleb stood behind Aldridge on the porch steps and said nothing, but she looked at his face and found in it everything she needed to know about how the last 24 hours had gone. She looked at Aldridge. "What do you need from me now?" "Your testimony," he said, "which I'd like to begin preparing today, if you're willing." "I'm willing. And the boy. I'll need to speak with Carson." "He's inside." Aldridge went in. She stayed on the porch for a moment. Caleb came up the steps and stopped beside her. "You didn't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question, not much. She looked out at the trail. "How did Aldridge take the ledger pages?" "He read them 3 times in a row and then said something under his breath that I don't think he intended for company." Caleb almost smiled. "He's ready. And you ready?" He looked at her. "For what? For what happens after? Win or lose, this ends in 8 days. Morrow goes back to his business or he doesn't. The hearing closes and the federal situation starts or it doesn't." She kept her voice level. "And then the reason I came up here, the reason I needed somewhere to be, that reason is over. One way or another." The air between them went very still. Caleb stood with his hat in his hands and looked at her, and said nothing for a long moment, the way he said nothing when he was working something out that was important enough to deserve precision. "Is that what you're thinking about?" he said. "Where you go after?" "I think about it some," she said honestly. "I think it's fair to think about it." "Where would you go?" he asked. And the way he asked it, careful, quiet. The particular weight of a man who was asking, because the answer mattered to him personally, and he knew he couldn't hide, that entirely told her something she'd suspected for weeks and hadn't let herself confirm. She looked at him. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on." She stopped. "There are things I don't know yet, that I'm waiting to understand better before I make any decisions." He held her gaze. Something moved through his face, that complicated thing she'd first started seeing in week 2 and had been watching ever since. The internal weather of a man learning to want something again after years of deciding not to. "All right," he said. "Quiet, careful," meaning more than the words. He put his hat back on and went inside to talk to Aldridge. She stood on the porch for a moment, with the August sun on her face and the sound of the mountain around her and 80 days standing between her and whatever came next. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even exactly hoping. In the desperate way she'd been hoping for months, the thin, brittle hope of someone with no other resources. This was something else. Something older and sturdier. The hope of someone who has built something real with her own hands and knows what it's worth, and is not going to let anyone take it from her. She went inside. There was work to do. The night before the hearing was quiet, in the way that nights are quiet when everyone in a place is awake and not saying so. Evelyn knew Caleb wasn't sleeping because she could hear him moving in the kitchen around midnight, the particular careful sound of someone trying not to be heard, which she'd come to know as his version of restless. She lay in her room for 20 minutes listening to it, and then she got up and put on her robe and went to the kitchen. He was at the table with cold coffee and the lamp turned low. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything about her being there. She sat down across from him, the same place she'd sat the first night, the same table. It occurred to her that almost everything important that had happened between them had happened at this table. "Tell me the worst version," she said. He looked at her. "What?" The worst version of tomorrow. Say it out loud. If we go through that courtroom and Aldridge does everything right, and Morrow still has more pull than we do with the judge, and it goes wrong, what happens? He was quiet for a moment. Aldridge says even in the worst case, even if the local hearing goes against you, the federal issue doesn't go away. Morrow can't make the marshal's investigation disappear. But I'd have a conviction on my name. Yes, and starting over somewhere new with that is hard, he said, but not impossible, she nodded. She'd thought through all of it. She just needed to hear it from someone else, to make sure she wasn't softening it in her own mind. And the best version, she said. He looked at her steadily. Aldridge presents the ledger pages. Carson testifies. Ferris testifies. The pattern is clear enough that the judge can't reasonably find for Morrow without exposing himself to the federal scrutiny that's already started. He paused. Morrow loses. Your name is cleared on the record. Whatever happens after, with the marshal's investigation, you're not the accused anymore. And then, she said. He looked at her across the table. And then he said carefully, you and I have a conversation we haven't had yet. She held his gaze. About what? He set both hands flat on the table. He looked like a man who had come to a ledge he'd been approaching for weeks and had decided quietly and without ceremony to step off it. About whether you want to stay, he said. Not as my housekeeper. Not because you need somewhere to be, because you want to. He held her eyes. I'm not asking you to answer tonight. I'm not asking you to answer for a long time if you need a long time. He paused. I'm just telling you that when this is over and you're making decisions about where you go, that's a choice. A real one, not a kindness I'm offering, a choice. Evelyn Harper looked at Caleb Thornton across the kitchen table in the low lamplight and felt the thing she'd been carrying since at least week 3 land somewhere solid and permanent inside her. She said. I nodded once. Try to sleep, she said. We have to leave early. She got up and went back to her room. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the mountain and the August wind in the pines and thought about the word home that he'd said, without planning to, on the main street of Harlan Creek. And what it meant that she'd kept it without saying so, and what tomorrow would bring, and whether she was ready. She was. She had been ready since the morning she'd walked into that barn and told him about the garden, and he'd moved the water barrel that same afternoon, without being asked again. And she'd understood then, though she hadn't said it to herself in those terms, that this was a man who paid attention, who acted on what he understood, who did not need to be convinced twice when the right thing was clear. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would go to Harlan Creek and face everything that had been coming for them since the beginning. And whatever happened in that courtroom, she would face it with her back straight and her name intact, and a man who had moved a water barrel and said it ain't conversation and looked at her across this table in the low light and told her the truth. That was enough to walk into anything with. More than enough. They left before sunrise. Caleb had the horses ready by 4:30, saddled and watered and standing quiet in the dark. Evelyn came out of the house in her best dress, the dark green one she'd bought with her 3rd week's wages from Hallett's. The one she'd set aside for exactly this, and she had her hair pinned properly and her back straight, and she looked like someone who had decided at some fundamental level what she was and was not going to apologize for any of it. Caleb looked at her when she came off the porch steps. He didn't say anything. He just held the gray mare steady and waited for her to mount. That was enough. Aldridge met them at the edge of Harlan Creek at 7 as arranged. He'd ridden in the night before and stayed at the one boarding house in town that wasn't connected to anyone connected to Morrow, which had taken some doing, but which he'd managed. He had his leather case and his steel-rimmed glasses, and the particular focused energy of a man who had prepared as thoroughly as preparation allowed and was now ready to find out if it was enough. Carson was with him, pale and young, and doing the thing young men do when they're frightened, and trying not to show it, holding themselves very still, as if stillness and courage were the same thing. They weren't, but the effort was real, and Evelyn squeezed the boy's arm once when she came close enough and said, "You're doing the right thing," and he nodded like he needed to hear it said out loud one more time. "How are we standing?" Caleb asked Aldridge. "Morrow's lawyer is a man named Fettel from Billings. Good reputation. He's competent and he'll be aggressive." Aldridge adjusted his case. "Judge Harmon is circuit. He's been on this bench 11 years. He's not Morrow's man, I checked carefully, but he's a cautious judge, which means he'll want clear evidence rather than inference." He looked at Evelyn. "That's where you come in. You are our clearest evidence. Your memory, your account, your knowledge of those books. When I put you on the stand, I need you to be exactly what you are." "What's that?" she said. "A woman who knows exactly what she saw and isn't going to be rattled out of it," he said. She looked at him. "Then we're ready." The courtroom in Harlan Creek was a converted room at the back of the town hall, 3 rows of benches, a judge's table at the front, 2 tables facing it for each side, and a witness chair that was just a regular chair placed slightly apart from everything else. It held maybe 40 people in the gallery, and it was by 8:30 in the morning, nearly full. Evelyn had expected that. Small towns came to their hearings. She'd known when she walked in that there would be faces she recognized, and faces that had turned away from a stretch 2 months ago, and faces she'd never seen but who'd heard a version of her name that Gerald Morrow had given them. She sat at Aldridge's table and looked straight ahead. Caleb sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind her. She couldn't see him, but she could feel the particular quality of his presence, that steady, rooted stillness that she'd come to understand as the physical form of his attention. He was there. That was all it needed to be. Gerald Morrow came in at 8:45 with his lawyer and 2 witnesses she didn't recognize, and Sheriff Dade, who sat in the gallery on Morrow's side with his badge on and his arms crossed and his eyes doing that thing they always did, looking without seeing. Morrow glanced at her when he came in, just briefly. His expression was composed and confident, and underneath the confidence was something she recognized now, the particular assurance of a man who has won every version of this situation before and sees no reason why this one should be different. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away. She wasn't angry anymore. She'd been angry for months, a clean, cold, very useful anger, but sitting here in this room with Aldridge's leather case on the table, and Carson in the gallery, and 3 months of Caleb Thornton's steady presence at her back, the anger had settled into something quieter and more durable. She was ready. Judge Harmon came in at 9 exactly. He was a lean man in his 60s with a gray beard and reading glasses he kept taking on and off, and he ran his courtroom with the economy of someone who had a great deal more territory to cover and not enough days to cover it. He looked at both tables. "This is the matter of Morrow versus Harper. Civil action, theft of property. Mr. Fettel, you're representing the plaintiff?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Mr. Aldridge, the defense?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let's begin." Fettel opened efficiently and well. He presented the $40. He presented Morrow's testimony about the missing cash, given in a steady merchant's voice that sounded like every reasonable man in every reasonable town explaining a reasonable problem. He presented 2 character witnesses, men who'd done business with Morrow for years, who said what men say when a wealthy neighbor has asked them to say something. That Morrow was honest, that his accounts were always in order, that they'd never known him to bring a false charge against anyone. He did not present Sheriff Dade as a witness, which Evelyn noticed and which Aldridge noticed, and which meant, she thought, that Fettel was smart enough to know that Dade had become a liability. Then Aldridge stood up. He began quietly. He always began quietly. She'd noticed it in their preparation sessions. He built from the bottom. He started with her work history, her time at Morrow's store, her record as a bookkeeper, the accounts she'd managed over 2 years. He made her real before he made her wronged. He made her a person with a skill set and a professional history and a specific function in Morrow's enterprise, so that by the time he got to the $40, the jury of Judge Harmon's good sense had a complete picture of who she actually was. Then he called her to the stand. She sat in the witness chair and looked at Aldridge and answered every question he asked her in the clear, precise voice she'd used for 2 years in Morrow's back office when the numbers were complicated and she needed them to be right. She described the bookkeeping system. She described the quarterly ledgers. She described the specific entry, the date, the column, the amount that didn't match the corresponding receipt. She described bringing it tomorrow. She described the way he took the ledger from her. She described his expression, which she said was calm, and his posture, which she said was unhurried, and the specific way he'd told her he'd handle it himself, which she said was the manner of a man who already knew what the discrepancy was and wasn't surprised to be asked about it. She said all of this without drama and without emotion, and with the specificity of a woman who had been thinking about nothing else for 3 months. Then Fettel stood up to cross-examine. He was good. She'd expected him to be good, and he was. He tried the obvious angles, first her motivation, her financial situation at the time, whether she'd ever had access to the cash box alone. She answered all of it. He tried to create doubt about her memory, the particular entry, the date, how she could be certain 3 months later. She told him she'd written down the entry in her personal notebook the same evening, a practice discrepancy she couldn't immediately resolve, and that notebook was in her possession. Fettel paused. "You have a personal record of this entry?" "Yes," she said. Aldridge was already on his feet. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this document as evidence." The notebook went in. The gallery shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Something had moved in the room, some consensus had cracked along a line nobody had been paying attention to. Morrow at his table said something very quietly to Fettel. She couldn't hear the words. She could read the tone. He was recalculating. Then Aldridge called Carson. The boy walked to the witness chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to do a hard thing and is not going to let the hardness of it show in front of the people he's walking past. He sat down. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Aldridge. He told the truth. He told it simply and completely, finding the discrepancy. Going tomorrow. Morrow's smile, the same smile Evelyn had described. He described making the copies. He described riding to the ranch. He described why. Fettel's cross-examination of Carson was aggressive in a way that it hadn't been with Evelyn, because Carson was younger and less certain in his manner, and Fettel was looking for the place where the boy's nerve would break. It didn't break. Carson looked at Fettel when the questions got hard and said, "Sir, I know what I found, and I know what I copied, and I know what Mr. Morrow said when I brought it to him. I can't be uncertain about something I'm certain about just because you're asking me to." Something in the gallery made a sound, not a laugh. Something closer to recognition. Judge Harmon looked at Carson over his reading glasses for a moment and said nothing, but something in his expression shifted in a way that Evelyn caught and held. Ben Ferris was the third witness. He was an old man, broad through the chest, and weathered past the point of any particular age, and he walked to the witness chair with the slow surety of someone who has decided to stop being quiet about something, and is experiencing, for the first time in 2 years, the relief of that. He told the story of the land sale, the road assessment that never existed, the price that reflected a threat that was a lie. He told it plainly in the voice of a man who raised sheep and fixed his own fences and didn't have any use for elaborate language. When he was done, Fettel stood up and said, "Mr. Ferris, isn't it possible? You simply misunderstood the nature of the conversation with Mr. Morrow." Ferris looked at him. "Son," he said, "when a man tells you a road is going through your south field and you ought to sell before the price drops to nothing, and then 6 months later there's no road and never was any road, and he's turned your land for 3 times what he paid you, that ain't a misunderstanding. That's a man who lied to you." He paused. "I understand the difference." Fettel sat down. Morrow said something to him again. This time she could see Fettel's answer in the set of his shoulders, the slight drop that meant there's nothing I can do about this right now. Then Aldridge entered the ledger pages. 3 copied pages, Carson's handwriting, the columns clear, and the discrepancies marked. Aldridge walked Judge Harmon through each one with the patience of a man who knows that the most devastating things are most devastating when explained quietly. When he was done, he said, "Your Honor, these 3 entries correspond to 3 property transactions in which the plaintiff acquired land at prices that can only be explained by false information provided to the sellers. The $40 allegedly taken by Miss Harper is not, we submit, the beginning of this story. It is the end of it. It is what happens when a man who has been running a more significant fraud discovers that the woman keeping his books is about to find it." Fettel objected. Harmon overruled him. The room was very quiet. Morrow was looking at the table in front of him. He was not looking at Evelyn. He had stopped looking at her somewhere around the time the notebook went in as evidence, and he had not looked at her since, and she understood that this was the thing she'd needed, not revenge, not his suffering specifically. But the moment when the frame he'd built around her became visible enough that he couldn't look through it anymore and see her as the problem. The moment when she became, to everyone in this room, what she had always been. A woman who did her job honestly and paid for it. Judge Harmon did not deliberate long. 20 minutes. They waited in the hall, all of them: Evelyn, Caleb, Aldridge, Carson, Ferris, with the sound of Harlan Creek going about its ordinary business on the other side of the wall. Pete and Monroe Alcott were outside, ostensibly tending the horses, actually keeping eyes on the street, because Cord Beller had been seen in town that morning, and nobody had seen him leave. Caleb stood beside her in the hall. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that their arms almost met, that particular distance he'd maintained for months, close enough to be present, far enough to leave her room. She'd thought about that distance often, the deliberateness of it, the respect inside it. "However it goes," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Same as the night before." He looked at her. "Do you?" She turned to look at him. His face in the dim hall light was everything she'd learned to read over 3 months: the jaw, the careful eyes, the particular stillness that was the opposite of absence. "Yes," she said. The door opened. Aldridge stepped back inside. They followed. Judge Harmon settled his glasses, looked at both tables, and said, "I find for the defense." 3 words. That was all. She heard them and felt them travel through her body from the top of her head to the floor. And the thing they displaced on their way through was 3 months of weight that she hadn't entirely known she was still carrying until it was gone. "The evidence presented does not support the plaintiff's claim," Harmon continued. "Furthermore, the documentary evidence and testimony entered by the defense raises questions about the plaintiff's financial practices that fall considerably outside the scope of this hearing, but will be referred, by this court, to the Federal Marshal's office in Helena for appropriate review." He looked at Morrow over his glasses. "Mr. Morrow, I would encourage you to make yourself available for that process." Morrow said nothing. Fettel said, "Understood, Your Honor." Harmon looked at Evelyn. "Miss Harper, you are cleared of all charges in this matter." "The record will reflect that." He gathered his papers. "We're adjourned." The gallery noise hit her before she could prepare for it, not a cheer exactly. More the particular sound of a room full of people releasing held breath all at once. She heard Robert Hallett's voice somewhere behind her say something to the man next to him. She heard Ben Ferris tell Carson he'd done well. She heard Aldridge say, close to her ear, "Miss Harper, well done. Now let's get out before Fettel reorganizes." She stood up. Caleb was right there. He'd come through the gallery rail the moment Harmon called adjournment, which was probably not protocol, and which he did not appear to be concerned about. He was standing in front of her and looking at her face, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was too much to say and none of it required words right now. "Clear on the record," she said finally. Her voice was mostly even. He said, "Clear on the record." "I heard," Caleb said. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the Harlan Creek Town Hall. She had decided this in advance, and she intended to hold to it. "We should go," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. They went. They were almost to the horses when Morrow appeared. He came out a side door, Fettel behind him and Cord Beller a few steps back, and for a moment the street rearranged itself around this particular configuration of people, Caleb and Evelyn and the Alcott brothers, who had materialized the moment they saw Beller, and Morrow in his good suit in the August sun, looking like a man who had just had something very large taken from him, and hadn't entirely finished deciding what to do about it. He looked at Evelyn. "This isn't finished," he said. His voice was still controlled. He was good at controlled. "The federal process will take months. You think Aldridge can sustain that kind of?" "Mr. Morrow," Caleb said. Morrow looked at him. "The judge just sent a referral to the federal marshal's office that has your name on it," Caleb said. "Aldridge has the ledger pages, and Ferris's testimony and Carson's account filed and entered into the record. The marshal's office has a copy of everything we sent them 10 days ago." He paused. "You should probably stop talking and go find out what your legal situation looks like." Morrow stared at him. Beller took one step forward. Pete Alcott moved to his left, and Monroe moved to his right, and the movement was so quiet and so calibrated that it happened before Beller finished the step. 3 men. The geometry of it was clear enough. Beller stopped. Morrow looked at Beller. He looked at the Alcott brothers. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Evelyn last, and something crossed his face in that last look. Not remorse. She didn't think he was capable of remorse, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had built a machine he was certain would run forever, and was only now, standing in the sun in the main street of his own town with a federal referral on his name, beginning to understand that machines built on other people's destruction have a particular kind of ending. He turned and walked away. Beller followed him. Fettel, to his small credit, looked at Evelyn and said, "For what it's worth, Miss Harper," and then appeared to think better of whatever he'd been going to add and simply tipped his hat and went. The street settled. Carson appeared at her elbow, looking like a man who'd just survived something significant and was still taking inventory of himself. "Is it over?" he said. "The hearing's over," she said. "The rest takes longer." She looked at him. "You were very brave today." He shook his head. "I was scared the entire time." "That's what brave is," she said. "Being scared and doing it anyway." He thought about that. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "Morrow's books." "I'm done there," he said. "I was done the morning I made those copies." He almost smiled. Mr. Hallett said, "He might have something for a person who knows accounts." "I'm going to go talk to him this afternoon." "Good," she said. "That's a good place to start." He nodded, tipped his hat and went. She stood in the street for a moment. Aldridge was talking to Caleb something about the federal timeline, what to expect in the coming months, practical legal geography of the process. She listened to enough of it to know she'd hear a full accounting later and let the rest of it be background. She looked at Harlan Creek, the main street, Hallett's general store, the church she'd attended for 2 years before the doors stopped being open to her, the boarding house that had asked her to leave, the sheriff's office, where Dade was presumably sitting right now figuring out what a federal referral, with his name adjacent to it, meant for his very near future. She felt none of what she'd expected to feel looking at it. Not triumph, not grief, not the particular satisfaction of a score settled. Just clarity, the simple, clean feeling of a story that has found its actual shape after months of being forced into the wrong one. She'd come to this town 2 years ago looking for a place to put down roots. She'd found work and lost it. She'd found standing and had it stripped. She'd walked away with 3 things in a bag and 31 miles between her and the next chapter. She looked at the main street of Harlan Creek. She didn't need it anymore. The ride back up the mountain was quiet for the first mile, which was the Alcott brothers' mile they rode ahead, giving space. reading the situation with the particular social intelligence of men who work outdoors and understand the difference between presence and intrusion. Then they pulled further ahead, and it was just Caleb and Evelyn side by side on the trail, the summer afternoon settling into the long gold light of late August, the mountain ahead of them and the town behind. "Aldridge thinks the federal case will move in the next few months," she said. "He said as much. He'll need me for testimony. Not often, but some." "I know." She looked at the trail ahead. "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "I came up this mountain because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "That was the truth then, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. I was desperate and I needed somewhere to land, and you opened the gate." She kept her voice steady. "But somewhere in the last 3 months, the reason I was staying changed. And I want you to know that. I want you to know the difference between staying because I had to and staying because she stopped. Found the rest of it. Because I'd found something I didn't want to leave." Caleb rode for a moment without answering. Then he said, "I know the difference." "Do you?" "Yeah." He looked at her. "I've been watching for it." The moment it changed, he paused. "I think it was the water barrel." She blinked. "The water barrel. You asked if you could fix the garden and said you needed the barrel moved closer to the south side. I moved it that afternoon." His voice was the quietest it ever was, which meant it was carrying the most. "And you went out the next morning and got started, without saying another word about it. Like it was just done. Like that was just how things worked between us." He looked at the trail. "I thought about that all day. Couldn't figure out why it stuck with me. Later I understood. It was the first time something between us felt like a habit. Like something that had been going on longer than it had." She looked at him. "That's when I knew I was in trouble," he said. Not lightly, not as a joke, just the plain truth of it. "What kind of trouble?" she said. He looked at her directly. "The kind where you start caring what someone thinks of you. Where you start hoping they'll stay." He paused. "The kind I hadn't been in for a long time." She held his gaze for a moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them. The mountain got closer. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He was quiet. "I mean that plainly," she said. "Not as comfort. Not as gratitude. I'm telling you that I looked at this situation from every angle I know how to look at it, and what I found was that the place I want to be is on that ranch. Tending that garden. Keeping those accounts." She paused. "And having supper with you every night at 6 and arguing about whether Cassius is arrogant by nature or by choice." He made the sound again, that genuine startled sound that was his version of a laugh. She'd been collecting those. She had quite a few of them now. "He's arrogant by nature," Caleb said, "and he's earned it." "He absolutely has not. He's from good stock, he's insufferable." She watched the side of his face. He was doing the thing where he was trying not to let too much through, and not entirely succeeding, which was her favorite version of him. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." He pulled Cassius to a slow stop. She brought the gray mare alongside, and they sat there on the trail, with the mountain ahead and the afternoon light all around them, and he looked at her with the full weight of 6 years of solitude, and 3 months of something growing in the opposite direction of everything that solitude had built. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it right." "Then take your time," she said. He took a breath. "I've been alone a long time because I decided after Thomas, after everything, that caring about people was too costly. That the math didn't work. You care about someone. You build your life to include them. And then something happens, because something always happens, and you're left carrying a weight that doesn't go away." He looked at her. "I had made my peace with that, with the math of it. And now," she said quietly. "And now," he said, "I've been sitting at the same table as you for 3 months, and watching you do the right thing in a situation that was designed to make the right thing impossible, and I've been thinking about Thomas." He paused. "Thomas would have said I was being a fool. The long version, spending 6 years deciding not to live because living costs something." He held her gaze. He would have been right. She didn't say anything. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "not as my housekeeper. Not as someone who needs somewhere to be." As he stopped. "Found it. As mine. If you're willing." The trail was very quiet. She looked at him, this man who had opened a gate for a stranger in July heat and given her water and a room and honest work and a place to stand, and his presence at her back when the thing that had been hunting her finally showed its face. This man who had moved a water barrel and said it ain't conversation and ridden through the night to Helena and sat across from her in the low lamplight and told her the truth when it mattered. "I'm willing," she said. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand. His hand was rough and warm, and it held hers with the particular care of someone who has been holding things gently because he knows what it means when things break. They sat like that for a moment on the trail. Then she said, "We should get back. Monroe will have burned supper. Monroe always burns supper when it's his turn. Which is why it should be my turn." He squeezed her hand once and let go. He put his heels to Cassius. She put her heels to the gray mare. They rode up the mountain toward home. The ranch changed after that. Not in any dramatic way. Nothing about Caleb Thornton was dramatic. Which was one of the things she had come to love completely about him, but in the small accumulated ways that mark the difference between a place someone lives and a place someone lives with someone else. The kitchen table, which had always had two chairs facing each other, grew comfortable with both of them occupied at the same time. The garden expanded the way she'd told him it could, producing through September and into October at a rate that meant they wouldn't be buying vegetables until spring. Cassius, insufferable as ever, began tolerating her presence in the barn with the gracious condescension of a king who has decided, for reasons of his own, that a particular subject is acceptable. She wrote to Aldridge twice a month. The federal case moved the way Aldridge had said it would, slowly, methodically, with the particular grinding weight of official machinery. Morrow's accounts were subpoenaed. The land transactions were reviewed. Dade resigned his position in October, before the subpoena with his name on it formally arrived, which Aldridge said meant he was cooperating with the federal process, which was simultaneously good and enraging, and which she decided to accept as the imperfect justice it was. Carson got the job at Hallett's. He came up the mountain once to tell her in person, bringing a small jar of honey from his mother's kitchen as a thank you, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with the relaxed ease of a young man who has done something difficult and found the other side of it habitable. Ben Ferris sent a letter in October. One paragraph. He said the land, the Carver parcel, was being reviewed for return to him as part of the federal proceeding. He said he didn't know yet if it would happen, but he was grateful to have the chance. He said, "I should have said something sooner. I'm glad you gave me the chance to say it at all." He signed it B. Ferris with no further embellishment, which was exactly right. She kept the letter. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, with the first suggestion of autumn moving through the mountain air, Caleb came in from the north pasture and found her in the kitchen going through the ranch's quarterly accounts, which she'd taken over entirely in September, and which were now that someone with actual bookkeeping skill was managing them considerably more organized than they'd been. He looked over her shoulder at the ledger. "Are we solvent?" he said. "We're better than solvent," she said. "The fall cattle prices held and the garden savings are significant, and you've been undercharging the Alcott brothers for board by about 15%. They're good workers, they are. You can be generous and accurate simultaneously." She made a note. "I'll adjust it forward, not backward. No need to make it awkward." He looked at the side of her face for a moment. She felt him looking and kept writing. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." She stopped writing. She turned to look at him, standing at her shoulder, with the afternoon light from the east window on him, still in his work clothes, hat in his hand. Looking at her with the particular expression that had no name she'd found yet, but that she'd been keeping every instance of it, like pressed flowers. The look that meant this specifically, I wasn't sure I'd have this again, and here it is." "You could sit down," she said. "Coffee's still warm." "In a minute," he said. He stayed standing there for another moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." She set the pen down and turned in the chair to face him properly. "I don't have a ring," he said. I wasn't planning this for a particular afternoon. I've been thinking about the right time, and there probably isn't a right time. There's just the time you're in." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. "Caleb," she said. "Yes. You opened your gate for a woman with a canvas bag and 3 things in it and 31 miles of dust on her boots," she said. "And you gave her water and a room and honest work, and you moved the water barrel, and you sat across from her at that table for 3 months, and you told her the truth every single time it mattered." He waited. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He exhaled a long, slow breath that carried in it something she'd never heard from him before. Relief, deep and unguarded, the relief of a man who has been holding something carefully for months and has just been told he can set it down. He sat down in the chair beside her. He took her hand. They sat at the kitchen table with the autumn light coming in, and the accounts open in front of them, and the mountain all around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was exactly right. Because there was nothing else that needed saying. The woman who had walked 50 miles to find a place to belong had found it. The man who had spent 6 years deciding that the cost of caring was too high had found out what it actually cost to stop, and he had chosen, with both eyes open, to pay the living price instead. And the gate that Caleb Thornton had opened on a July afternoon in 1882 for a woman the whole town had decided was not worth believing, that gate had never needed to close again. This was home. It always had been. They had simply found their way to it together.